Queen Elizabeth I had a truly inventive godson who built a flush toilet for her own personal use. The very first modern flushable toilet was described in 1596 by Sir John Harington, an English courtier and the godson of Queen Elizabeth I. Harrington's device called for a long 2-foot-deep oval bowl that was specially waterproofed with pitch, resin and wax. It was fed by water from an upstairs cistern. Henry VII had a pet monkey. As well as lions and other dangerous animals, which he kept at the Tower of London, Henry kept a pet monkey, thought to be a marmoset, in his private chambers. One day he discovered it had torn up his detailed diary, so there is a gap in his meticulous records. This monkey was supposedly sold off by Henry VIII later after his father's death. Upper-class women in the Tudor era exposed their breast for fashion. Even Elizabeth was known to greet the French ambassador with her entire breast exposed. According to an article by Louis Montrose called, "Shaping Fantasies," it was customary for women until they were married, and Queen Elizabeth used it to assert her status as Virgin Queen. It is even documented she would sometimes have her belly exposed as well. Some of Sir Thomas More's last words before his beheading were jokes and cheerfulness. He repeated the Miserere psalm with much devotion, and, rising up, the executioner asked him forgiveness. He kissed him, and said, "Pick up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short, take heed therefore thou strike not awry for having thine honesty." Laying his head upon the block, he bid the executioner stay till he had put his beard aside, for that had committed no treason. Thus he suffered with much cheerfulness. Mary, Queen of Scots. Her dress started moving after she was beheaded. Turned out it was her little dog who had been under her skirt. When her executioner held up her head to show the crowd she was wearing a wig. She was executed in a red petticoat, the color for martyrs. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a bad axe man at her execution and he botched it. He only partially decapitated her and she was still conscious and said, "Oh God," and he had to take another whack with the axe. It was a horrible death. And a horrible profession. Lots of executioners had to drink heavily to follow through, and it made their ability to cleanly do their job a lot more challenging. At Henry VIII's funeral his coffin exploded. He was large and heavy and all the gas just built up. Not the after-death care we have nowadays to prevent this. There was a prophecy about this. A prophecy by a Franciscan friar. Here's a quote. Apparently, some liquid leaked out of it onto the floor at Sion, and this was thought to fulfill the prophecy made by Franciscan friar William Peto in 1532. He had preached in front of the king at Greenwich that God's judgment were ready to fall upon his head and that dogs would lick his blood, as they had done to Ahab. Henry VIII is buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. In his tomb are his third wife, Jane Seymour, Charles I, and an infant son of Queen Anne. King Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. Henry had previously commanded he be buried with his beloved wife Jane Seymour. She was the only one of his 6 wives to give birth to a surviving legitimate male heir. Henry had given her a magnificent funeral, after which she was buried in a vault under the choir of St. George's Chapel in Windsor. When Queen Anne Boleyn's head was removed and held up to the crowd at her execution in 1536, it is said her mouth kept moving. She had been found guilty of charges including adultery, incest and conspiracy against the king. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded by a French swordsman with a sword. Elizabeth outbid Catherine de' Medici for Mary, Queen of Scots' black pearls after Mary was imprisoned in England. These pearls are in the Armada portrait and are still present in Queen Elizabeth II's crown, although only a few remain. It is also known that Richard Burton bought Elizabeth Taylor a pearl which was originally almost 56 carats, La Peregrina, and it was originally owned by Mary I. Philip II of Spain gave it to Mary I as a wedding gift. It once was the largest pearl ever found. Queen Mary I and her sister Queen Elizabeth I are buried in the same tomb in Westminster Abbey. Queen Elizabeth is buried on top of Queen Mary. Elizabeth was buried at Westminster Abbey in the vault of her grandfather, Henry VII, until she was moved in 1606 to her present resting place, a tomb in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey which she shares with her half-sister Mary I. Mary, Queen of Scots, was very tall. Once grown, Mary was exceptionally tall, almost 6 feet, but she remained light and graceful, and, before the long years of imprisonment, she was trim and athletic, riding, hawking, playing real tennis, and dancing. Her hands were thought particularly fine, long, white and graceful. In 1540 Henry ordered the destruction of any stallion rounded up from the commons under 15 hands to be destroyed, along with mares and foals under 13 hands. He thought the horses in England were becoming scraggly. The Breed of Horses Act 1535 and the Horses Act 1540 were pieces of legislation passed by the Parliament of England. Annual roundups of the commons were enforced, and any stallion under the height limit was ordered to be destroyed. Robert Dudley used to go to the Tower of London to visit and feed the porcupines in the royal menagerie there. He had been a prisoner there in the Tower only a few years before. Robert Dudley was imprisoned in the Tower of London, attainted, and condemned to death, as were his father and 4 brothers. His father went to the scaffold. In the Tower, Dudley's stay coincided with the imprisonment of his childhood friend, 19 Edward, and Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, who was sent there on suspicion of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. King Henry VIII once said that he had been walking the streets with a very large weapon. Surprisingly enough, he wasn't recognized by his own men and was arrested for carrying a weapon in the streets. Not only did he not punish the men who arrested him, he gifted the prisoners and the jailers better rations for their comfort.